She cheated months after our wedding. I followed her, collected proof, took her to court, and won back our life, property, and dignity. I remember the day I married Elena like an overexposed photograph, bright and impossible to look away from. We had been together for 5 years, years stitched into the fabric of ordinary life. Small jokes only we kept, fights that felt finite, and a silence that was comfortable because it was shared. We were young enough to believe love could be both map and compass. Our families blessed us. The apartment felt ours, and I promised myself I would notice the small things. How she twisted her hair when thinking, how she left a window open a slit even in winter. Those early months after the ceremony drifted like pages torn from a book. Little shifts became larger rifts. She came home later, smiling and saying her friends wanted to walk or that she needed air. I told myself newlywed adjustment explains odd habits, that I was being petty. I worked long hours, cooked dinners I hoped would anchor us, and waited for the warmth to return. My patience became a rope that frayed. She grew cooler, more distant. Her laugh no longer found me in rooms the way it used to. Our bedroom, once a refuge, felt like a guest room for someone I no longer knew. One ordinary Tuesday, something in me refused to sleep on suspicion. I did a small monstrous thing. I followed her. It wasn't cinematic. It was a man who refused to accept the slow disappearance of everything he loved. I trailed her through streets smelling of wet asphalt and sweet buns, watching the woman who had vowed to be mine move toward a cafe with another man. The sight hit like a stone to my chest. Bright photographs of our life blurred into one sharp betrayal. My world telescoped into two figures at a table. I stood there, breathing someone else's air, helpless and suddenly very afraid. I remember details. How his hand rested on her knee, the way she tilted her head toward him, the casual intimacy that had once been ours. The ground shifted, and I knew nothing would be the same. After I watched them, something in me broke, like glass. The rational man I had been, the one who flipped through expenses, fixed leaking pipes, and brought home groceries, felt replaced by a stranger furiously pacing a room. I went home to the empty apartment and turned on lights, as if illumination could erase what I had seen. My hands shook as I packed a bag. I did not yet know where I was going, only that I could not remain in the house that held her laughter in every corner. I drove to my older brother, Victor's place, needing the gravity of family. Victor and his wife, Nadia, had always been refuge spaces in my life, steadfast, pragmatic, and without the theatrical pity that other relatives offered. When I told them what I had seen, their faces tightened in the way people's faces do when they prepare to hold a heavy object. Victor did not ask for details. He made coffee, sat me down, and listened. Nadia offered me a coat and an honest look that recognized my humiliation without making it spectacle. They did not say, "Forgive her." They did not say, "He must be punished." They said, "We stand with you." That phrase was a small, necessary armor. In the days after, we planned. The plan did not begin from a place of cold legal counsel, but from raw grief. Who knew grief could sharpen into strategy. I read laws with Victor at kitchen tables, calling a lawyer recommended by a cousin, learning the small print about property rights and marital claims where we lived. It turned out the court often sided with the injured spouse, especially when evidence suggested deliberate betrayal. My hands learned to cradle paperwork instead of violence. I channeled rage into documentation. Instead of confronting them in the street, I gathered receipts, messages, and accounts. The house that felt like exile became a workshop of reclamation. Boxes, folders, and plans forming like scaffolding around a man rebuilding himself. I taught myself patience as a weapon, to sit through hearings and let the law speak. I held that patience steadfastly for me. I became methodical the way a craftsman becomes methodical around a project that must not fail. Every message I'd saved, every restaurant receipt, weekend photos, and a coffee shop check. These became pieces in a puzzle I was determined to complete. Victor sat with me through late nights transcribing text threads and cross-referencing dates. He would not let me destroy my life with a single blow. Instead, he taught me how to build a case that would stand in court. Nadia found small comforts for me. A plate of warm food when I forgot to eat, a towel when I finally stopped pacing and washed. Their ordinary tenderness felt like a lighthouse against the storm. As we assembled evidence, I kept returning to a question. Why had she done this? Betrayal is never simple. It is a landscape of excuses, selfishness, and sometimes a hunger that no one feeds. I replayed our years together and tried to find the first loose stitch. Had I been inattentive? Had I let routine dull the colors of our relationship? The thoughts were knives, and I let them cut, because in cutting they revealed seams I had ignored. But the deeper I dove into my introspection, the more I realized my culpability felt different from the act of betrayal itself. One could be imperfect without becoming treacherous. The lawyer we hired, a blunt woman named Mariana, was surgical with words. She traced property titles, pointed out expenses that proved shared intent, and explained how local courts often penalized deceit that enriched one spouse at the expense of the other. She also warned me about theatrics, about rage turned public, about revenge that failed the moment it mirrored the crime. Her counsel became a mirror and a map. Keep your dignity, collect the facts, and let the system adjudicate. It was a strange solace to trust a system when my trust in a person had been gutted. I slept in the spare room at Victor's for months, waking to the sound of plates, tiny, reliable routines, and steady anchors. I practiced calm like a muscle each day. The first hearing felt theatrical in the worst possible way. We sat in a room whose walls seemed to absorb truth, where echoes of other people's grievances had been filed like dust. Elena entered dressed as if nothing had happened, a careful palette of indifference. When her eyes met mine, she offered no apology. Instead, she wore the look of someone willing to perform innocence. She began to curse in the hallways before the judge, a venom I had not expected, and that seemed to surprise even her. I had imagined confrontation as quick, sharp, something that would resolve with a single reveal. But law is slow, and grief is patient in its cruelty. The judge was a man who reminded me of library tables, solid, heavy, and not easily moved. He listened to our initial statements, to Mariana's measured voice pointing out shared costs and shared intent, to Elena's accusations that I had been controlling or inattentive, to the counselor's reports we submitted showing the pattern of financial commingling. She sobbed theatrically at moments, casting back doubt to the past. Had she been wrong to marry me, she asked, or had I been unfaithful in ways she felt justified? It was a twist that added insult to injury. The courtroom buzzed like a hive, where the truth is one honeycomb among many. Outside, the gossip moved faster than justice. My phone rang with messages, some sympathetic, some cruel, others offering opinionated assurances that courts favored men like me. The troubling thing was not the messages, but the realization that my private life had been turned into a commodity. Still, each paper I presented, each ledger line tied a thread back to our shared economic life. After the session, we walked back to Victor's in a quiet exhaustion. Nadia passed me a sandwich and a look that said we were not finished. I learned in that season that victory is not the absence of noise. It is the slow, careful unspooling of truth from under layers of performance. Her curses were loud, but I recorded them calmly and submitted them to court. Depositions stretched like corridors of light and shadow. Witnesses we summoned gave careful truths. Neighbors who recalled seeing Elena leave late at night, a barista who remembered her laughter with another man, colleagues who spoke of expenses that we had shared. Mariana cross-examined with a patience I could not muster. She pressed on details, made the invisible visible, and turned vague resentment into tangible claims. Elena's counsel attempted to paint her as a woman pushed into moral panic by a husband who neglected emotional labor. The argument was familiar. The injured become accusing in ways that justify their own choices. It was a cynical script, and it played well for those who love a sensational narrative. There were sick days during this time, nights when I could not keep my head from the whirlpool of images. I wanted to scream at the unfairness, to rip up the contracts, and throw them at a world that allowed intimacy to be weaponized. Yet in court, theater darkened. Elena cried and cursed, and sometimes her words were so vicious they echoed like a challenge. During a recess, she found me in the hallway and spat a sentence I had not expected. She said she had always doubted marrying me. The words were a blade meant to wound. I felt the blade, and then put it aside like something used. Victor gripped my shoulder and reminded me of the plan: proof, patience, dignity. I imagined the verdict not as a final blow, but as a ledger balanced by evidence. In quiet moments between hearings, I would walk, looking at storefronts, and at the people not watching my life unravel. Their faces were a strange comfort. They existed outside the drama, and therefore held the secret of ordinariness. In those walks, I recovered a small part of myself. The man who enjoyed coffee in the morning, the man who paid for paint for an old door because he liked the color. The world was not only trial and testimony, it was also paint and small bowls and the soft breath of evening. This steadied me. Evidence accumulated like sediment. Some of it was banal. Bank transfers with both our names, a joint credit card paid with 2 signatures, a renovation invoice with my handwriting. Some of it cut deeper. Messages where she hinted at wanting something else, photos of late-night meetings, and a witness who confirmed seeing her with the man at an art gallery months before I followed her. Mariana presented the materials calmly, each page evidence of an economic life we had built together. The courtroom listened. Elena's reactions grew sharper. She accused me of surveillance, of being cruel, of turning a private pain into public humiliation. Her words were often laced with curses that leaked into the press outside and into social feeds where strangers took sides. At times, she seemed almost theatrical in her anger, performing a kind of wounded moral superiority that flattered those who loved a good scandal. But during cross-examination, she faltered. Small contradictions appeared in her account, contradictions that suggest a life lived in parallel. When a social media post surfaced, showing her, and the man celebrating his promotion, it felt like another nail. The legal machine moves slowly but surely. Each new piece of information tightened the net around the deceit. There were moments when I imagined confronting them both, when the old, raw rage rose, and I pictured things I would never allow to happen, violence that would ruin me. Those images frightened me because they were a mirror of what I might become. I fought them like an addiction, returning to the plan Victor had helped me build. I would not let my life become an angry footnote in someone else's story. Instead, I learned to translate fury into document requests and subpoenas, into witness lists and timelines. My revenge, such as it was, began to look like quiet restoration, the reclamation of what was mine and the reassembly of a life from facts and proof. Victor and Nadia sat in the back row at hearings, their steady presence a stubborn fact. When the judge asked for clarity, I spoke without trembling or apology. As the case pressed toward resolution, small cruelties hardened into a public pattern. Elena's curses became almost ritual. She used bitter words to try to unanchor me, to paint me as the villain of our story. She would say things in public that were not designed to persuade the judge, but to sting witnesses and to bend public opinion toward sympathy for her. The press began to frame our marriage as a morality play, with headlines that simplified a complex wound into morsels for consumption. I learned the strange economy of restraint. There were mornings when I woke to messages from people offering reckless advice, calls to automatically ruin her, to take everything and leave her with nothing. I felt the urge like a live wire. It warmed my hands and asked for action. But I had chosen another path. Punishment would not restore what I had lost. It would only remix the loss into something uglier. Instead, I spent my energy on credibility. Expert appraisals of our apartment's value, witness affidavits, and a careful inventory of our possessions that proved I had contributed, emotionally and financially, to its growth. There were legal skirmishes, requests to extend timelines, surprise motions from her counsel, a tense afternoon when a piece of evidence went missing, in transit only to be found on a dusty shelf 2 days later. These moments were tests. Would I unravel, shout, or seek petty retribution? I did none of those things. I sat, breathed, and rewound my memory to the promises we made in the quiet before the storm. Victor reminded me that the strongest revenge is the one that leaves you whole. It was an aphorism worth holding. When the final hearing was scheduled, My stomach turned like a boat in choppy water, but I felt a steadier hand on the tiller than I had months before. Once at a market, someone recognized me and whispered. The act of being watched felt invasive. I practiced answering calmly, rehearsing phrases that expressed sorrow without begging, dignity without arrogance, refusing to feed them. The decisive day arrived like a low, inevitable tide. Mariana had prepared an exhibit, a compiled timeline with bank records, messages, and a set of photos placing Elena and the man together in ways she had denied. She presented it calmly. The pages flipped like chapters, and the judge read with the slow inhalation of someone following a narrative to its end. Elena's counsel tried to object, but each objection felt thinner against the weight of documentation. The gallery of evidence was not theatrical. It was stark, paper truth arranged without flourish. When the judge turned to Elena and asked why the accounts showed transfers and why nights were unaccounted for, her composure cracked. She cursed with that furious, public heat, words meant to wound, and then for the first time in months, I saw shame, not performance. It was a small, human moment. A woman stripped briefly of the armor she had worn in public. The sound of her sputtering apologies felt strange. They were not for me so much as for herself, for the part of her that had once been a private person rather than a headline. I felt no glee. Revenge had never been about joy. It had been about reclamation. When the judge asked for restitution and clarified ownership of several assets, Mariana's arguments held. Witnesses corroborated our assertions. The room felt like something unmade and then stitched again. Outside, cameras lingered, but inside the chamber the cold mechanics of justice did their work without ceremony. I realized then that the path I had chosen, allowing the law to cut through the fog, had an odd dignity. I left the courthouse with Victor and Nadia, and though my hands shook, the shaking felt different. It was the tremor of someone who had endured a storm and emerged, not unscathed but steady. Outside, Elena screamed curses at us, and at cameras, a ragged storm of resentment. People shouted, drivers slowed. I felt an odd emptiness where triumph might have been. Victor squeezed my hand and said softly, "You did what you had to." It felt like closure opening its door. The verdict read like a ledger being finalized. The judge enumerated findings, shared contributions, deliberate concealment on some accounts, and restitution where appropriate. The language was legal and heavy, and it landed in the room like rain. Elena sat like someone exhausted by performing. She cursed less now and instead seemed to retreat into a cold, thin silence. The judge ordered that a fair share of the assets be returned to the marital estate, and he assigned certain holdings to me based on evidence of my contributions. It was not total victory. It was a jurisprudential correction that acknowledged wrongs and attempted to balance them. People around us reacted in various ways. The press attempted to translate the dry language into headlines. Neighbors whispered in doorways. My phone filled with messages, some kind, some snide, some simply stunned that a man could be both betrayed and vindicated in such public ways. I felt an absurd mix of relief and hollowness. In the parking lot, Elena approached the car and spat. "You think this makes you happy?" The question was more complicated than she imagined. Victory had a texture I had not anticipated. It was quieter than rage, heavier than relief, and edged with an aftertaste of loss. I took ownership of certain assets, the small things and the larger. A chair that had been my favorite, rights to paintings we bought together, a portion of savings earmarked for repairs, and the legal recognition of my contributions. Victor and Nadia celebrated with modest food and a few close friends. We raised a glass to stability, to truth, and to the finality of paperwork. Yet later that night, on the balcony of the reclaimed apartment, I watched the city and felt unfamiliar to it. I had wanted vindication, But what stood before me was a man who had traded naive certainty for complexity. Revenge had delivered restitution, but it also taught me that healing is a quieter, longer work. Rebuilding table conversations, repairing ordinary trust, and learning to hold my chest open to life again rather than to the ache of yesterday. I was ready. After the verdict, the pattern of my days altered subtly. People assumed a man given restitution would be transformed into a figure of unassailable confidence. They did not see the small, careful practices that actually mattered. Paying bills on time, fixing a leaky faucet, and sitting through quiet dinners without trying to measure the distance between where we had been and where I was now. Elena moved out of the apartment within weeks, leaving behind a few boxes and a loud, bitter letter that cursed me for weeks thereafter. Her curses had lost some of their power. They sounded raw and exhausted. Without the theater, they were only the noises of someone in deep regret or denial. Perhaps both. My life did not suddenly become perfect. The paintings I now owned felt like fragile trophies. I found myself avoiding places that reminded me of us, but also forcing myself to return to small rituals. Morning coffee, a run in the park, calls with Victor where he reminded me to live, not litigate. In time, I began to think about what I wanted beyond property. How to live with a heart that had been cracked, but was not beyond repair. I reconnected with friends I had let drift away, and I learned to say no to public curiosity. When acquaintances asked about the trial, I answered simply, "Truth matters, and evidence matters more than spectacle." Occasionally, Elena tried to provoke me with social posts, or with new claims filed by her counsel. They served only as reminders of the expense of human error. I had spent months translating rage into legal claims. Now I had to translate victory into a life worth inhabiting. Revenge had been a tool, not a home. I sold one painting and donated the proceeds to a shelter that cared for people rebuilding their lives. An oddly sacramental gesture that felt like penance and promise. The money did not erase the betrayal, but it gave me a forward motion. I began to sleep again, with less vigilance and more presence, and that small change felt like progress and peace. Update: months later, life had settled into an uneven but genuine peace. The court records gathered dust in a folder, while my days found a different rhythm. I returned to work with a quieter purpose, no longer performing a version of myself that was always on watch. My friends came over for meals that had nothing to do with law or scandal. They simply came because the food tasted good, and because we had practiced easy company. Victor and Nadia remained constant, sometimes a reminder, other times an invitation to be ordinary. Joy arrived in small increments. It was in the way sunlight hit the kitchen table at 9, in the new coffee shop owner who saved a chair, in the laughter of friends who knew me before and after the trial. I learned to enjoy the absurdity of weekdays. I began a weekend ritual. Run in the park, buy bread from a woman who recommended the rye, and then water the plants. I found a small studio where I could sit and make sketches, quick gestures on paper that had nothing to do with the courtroom and everything to do with making something for myself. Creative silence taught me to listen to quieter satisfactions. Financially, the restitution allowed me to fix things that had been deferred. A new boiler, fresh paint, and the repair of a table that was worth more sentimentally than monetarily. I went to the countryside with Victor and Nadia. We walked fields and ate simple food. There was laughter in that trip that had nothing to do with past drama. People asked if I forgave Elena. Forgiveness is a private, complicated thing. I felt no celebratory embrace toward her, yet I no longer defined myself by the wound she inflicted. Instead, I had room for other things. Music that made me think of childhood, books I had never finished, and small acts of generosity. Small joys stacked into a quiet fortune indeed.